A little over a century ago, the continent of Africa was carved up and shared among European powers. Every African nation, with the exception of Ethiopia and to some extent Liberia, was colonized for upwards of 70 years by these European powers. My country, Nigeria, was of course one of those countries. But I have no intention today of rummaging aimlessly through the ash heap of history. I know that colonialism is a thing of the past, and my country, alongside other African countries, have been independent, sovereign, and self-governing countries since the 1960s. For this independence, I am truly grateful. However, in recent years, we are noticing the return of Western footprints all across the continent of Africa. And when I say Western footprints, I'm not really speaking of the welcome footprints of those seeking business investments, trade, or scientific advancements on the continent of Africa. No, I am speaking about the footprints of cultural imperialists, social engineers, and ideological neo-colonial masters who have now presented themselves as enthusiastic donors, friends, and partners in the much-desired development in different African countries. Wealthy Western nations, powerful institutions, non-governmental organizations, and private foundations have become stakeholders and key players in most of the capitals of sub-Saharan Africa as they plan and propose ideologically driven projects that have not in most cases been demanded for in any real way by the African people. Let me say at this point, in full disclosure, that I am not a huge fan of humanitarian aid. I am not a huge supporter of aid in the way that it is done at the moment, because it has been demonstrated by renowned economists like Peter Bower, the British economist Peter Bower, who made clear in his writings, even from back in the early 1970s, that aid given over a long period of time can indeed be debilitating for its recipients. In his own words, from his excellent essay, Foreign Aid Forever, he said, aid pauperizes those it purports to assist. Aid pauperizes those it purports to assist. This he wrote in 1974. That was 45 years ago. Considering the situation in different parts of Africa, I agree with his observation. Now, aid, they've been giving us aid from the 1970s, even before the 1970s, from shortly after our independence. In most of the African countries, independence came in the 1960s. And we've been getting aid from the international community, from mostly Western countries. And even recently, or a while ago, there was an essay that was written by the Cato Institute, I think it was, and they revealed that per capita GDP has been decreasing and declining in most sub-Saharan African countries at 0.59% every year since 1975. But we have been getting aid, and yet the welfare of the people is going down, and our per capita GDP is going down. But I'll be quick to add that there is nothing wrong with, and in fact, everything laudable in people desiring to help others during national crises, regional crises, natural or man-made disasters. I have traveled now through different African countries and different African regions. I have spoken to so many people who are not shy to express or articulate what I would call the unmet demands of Africa. So people, wherever I go, if I ask them, what do you need? It's very easy for the African to tell you, there's no food here. We have problems with our school system or whatever. So I know that there are undeniable inadequacies in various systems across the continent of Africa. Now, here are some of the needs that I hear people asking for and speaking about from one country to the other. The first thing that an average African, I think, would want, if they mean well, is job opportunity, a secure job that can sustain them and can sustain their families. The average African, no matter what you hear, the average African does not want aid forever. They might need help at this moment, but nobody aims to have aid into the future. They want job opportunities. They want to be able to get a salary that can sustain them, that can sustain their families. Now, and as a prerequisite to that, they also want the good education that then prepares them for the lifelong job opportunity or the job opportunity right into the future, and vocational training. But it is no secret that Africa has, in fact, the worst and most lamentable statistics with regards to education. From the most recent UNESCO records, about 34 million African children who are primary school aged are not in school. 34 million. About 27 million of our lower secondary school aged youth are not in school. About 35 million of our upper secondary school aged youth are not in school. So in total, there are about 96 million young people in the sub-Saharan African region who should be in school and who aren't in school. Now, this already means that they have been set up automatically, these 96 million, for poverty. No matter what they do without education, they are not set and they are not prepared to take up the jobs or to get the job opportunities or the employment that would then ensure that they are able to migrate out of poverty, in economic migration out of poverty. And one thing I know from my own experience and from the people I've spoken with in different African countries is that the African people love education. We love education. Recently, there was a little girl who's maybe about 7 years old who went viral online, as now they say viral. She went viral on Facebook because some lady saw her. She was wearing her school uniform and she was walking away from school, the primary school where she was supposed to be attending, marching out of school at that time of the day, middle of the day that she should have been in school. So this lady followed her with a phone. I don't know why people do it now. Everything, people bring out a camera. But that saved the situation. And she brought out her phone and starts to film this little girl and ask her, why are you out of school? Why are you walking away from school? And the girl just turned and says to this woman very boldly, they chased me out of school because my parents have not paid the school fees. And this girl had you should see her. She had the rage that I could only describe as like an adult rage. She said, how could they? They chased me out of school. They told me to walk out of school because my parents haven't paid my school fees. And the lady said, but what did you tell them? She said, I told the teacher to beat me up and let me stay in school, punish me, let me stay in school, and then get to my parents and let them pay the school fees. Because I want to stay in school, and nobody should tell me to walk out of school. So it was just the desire and the passion with which she said it that everybody then noticed her. And at that point, every politician and every athlete wanted to be, to get to her and to get, how it is when something goes viral, everyone just wants to associate with you. So all of that, her life changed because everyone was then struggling to pay her school fees. But the Africans, they love education. It's something that is very much shared in most of the African countries, because once someone gets education, they already believe that they're getting the map out of poverty. In fact, it was only 2 days ago that the Franciscan friar, was so proud to see the Kenyan Franciscan friar from I think it was Nairobi. He won the Global Teacher Prize, which was given in Dubai. So while he got that award 2 days ago, somebody tweeted and said, oh, he won $1 million and he got a hug from Hugh Jackman, because Hugh Jackman was the person the MC who had mentioned the award, and this friar came up and of course was so emotional and hugged Hugh Jackman and said, oh, the person tweeting said, oh, he's so lucky he got $1 million and he got a hug from Hugh Jackman. And I said, no, actually Hugh Jackman got a hug from Peter Tabichi. So Hugh Jackman is indeed very, very fortunate. So this guy won the teacher award, which is the best teacher, however they rated the best teacher in the world, for all the amazing things that he does in his very poor community out in Kenya. So the education is a big deal in Africa. And while they were there, even the president of Kenya Skyped into this huge event, this beautiful big award event in Dubai, and was saying how proud they are of this teacher. So imagine how the whole nation just surrounded this man at this point in time for a teacher award. Now, there are other basic needs that people talk about in Africa, of course, that most people hear about or imagine that Africa would need, like food, food security, clean drinking water. And on this note of clean drinking water, I'd like to point out that in one of the speeches given on a World Environmental Day, the former and now late Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, stated that water-related diseases are in fact responsible for 80% of all illnesses and deaths in the developing world. So if this is indeed true, then this should be considered as an emergency, and it should dominate all discussions and all considerations on the international stage. Now, accessible and affordable healthcare is another issue that we should be talking about, because I worked as Father had mentioned in my introduction, I was working as a scientist, a laboratory scientist in Nigeria. So I have worked in a healthcare system, at least in an African country, and I do know that compared to the magnitude of our healthcare system challenges across the continent of Africa, there is very little attention given to the emerging and sometimes overwhelming problem of non-communicable diseases in Africa. I was telling someone some time ago that my auntie had, of blessed memory now, had passed away. She died because she had cancer. Within a few years, 1 or 2 years, she died. So for many people, cancer is like a death sentence in African countries. And this person asked me, so you people have cancer in Africa? Yes, we have cancer in Africa, and a lot of people have cancer in Africa. But no, I didn't blame the person for asking me that kind of question, because no one ever hears that the Africans have problems, health challenges and health problems like cancer. But there are other things as well. Like, for example, there are 1.7 million people today in my country, Nigeria, who are living with diabetes. 1.8 million people in South Africa are living with diabetes. 2.5 million people live with diabetes in Ethiopia. That's more than 5% of the entire adult population. And I know that there are millions of people who are living in the United States and other parts of the developed world who are living with the same disease, diabetes. But the reason I point out these millions of cases in Africa is that most of our healthcare systems are not even accessible or affordable for the ordinary African man or woman. Now, this means that any disease condition that requires long-term or lifetime treatment or management is absolutely near impossible to manage and will therefore mean unimaginable suffering for those affected. Imagine the millions of people in Africa who are affected by this problem of diabetes, and that no one ever hardly ever talks about. One of our family friends died only just a few months ago, and it wasn't diabetes particularly, but she needed dialysis, which of course in some cases when one has diabetes later in life, then they may need dialysis as the kidneys start having problems. Now, this lady needed dialysis in Nigeria. She only managed to get one dialysis, and they had to travel like 60, 70 miles to get there. She died within a very short space of time because, it's just not the kind of thing that you find in many African countries, the accessibility of dialysis and, healthcare facilities where one can get those kinds of care. But what African need has come to dominate discussions at international forums, because I go to all these UN events and I go to a lot of international events, and I keep waiting for the day somebody will bring up something like diabetes in Africa or cancer in Africa. No, they don't. The issue which dominates almost every discussion without exception is that of sexual and reproductive health and rights, commonly referred to as SRHR. This was not always the case, though, as the core theme of humanitarian aid discussions has morphed over the years. And I've tried to trace exactly where this predominant issue of sexual and reproductive health and rights, where it then became the dominating theme of international conversations when it has to do with Africa. And it's a little bit difficult to pinpoint, but I was able to track it to one single event in history, something that happened back in the 1990s, where things changed dramatically and where the developed world adopted a whole new strategy for aid and for all humanitarian aid that has to do with the developing world. Now, this was in September 1994, the United Nations coordinated an international conference on population and development, the ICPD, which happened in Cairo, Egypt, which brought together thousands of delegates from various governments, UN agencies, non-governmental organizations, you name it. At this event, the language of sexual and reproductive health and rights was then reshaped in terms of human rights. That was the point where they started describing these types of things with the same language as human rights. And the outcome document of this particular UN event did lay the foundation for international donors to then become the primary providers of contraceptive drugs and devices in poorer countries, as it specifically urged the international community in these words. So the outcome document for this ICPD event of Cairo, the 1994 event, stated, and I quote, "Move on an immediate basis to establish an efficient coordination system and global, regional, and sub-regional facilities for procurement of contraceptives and other commodities essential to reproductive health programs of developing countries and countries with economies in transition." And I do apologize to you if this seems like jargon. A lot of the UN documents do seem like jargon. When you read it, it's so confusing. And me, English is my second language. When I read this, I had to read it a few times and read it again. And I thought, they're telling them to provide contraceptives for us. So it does take time for you to understand, and I think that's the tactic, so that you're confused and you don't quite know what you're reading and you kind of glide through it. But it's telling them to move on an immediate basis, and then they should make sure that they are dealing with the procurement of contraceptives and other commodities which are essential to reproductive health programs of developing countries and countries with economies. It's just very long sentences, really bad punctuation. So you're just really confused and tired by the time you get to the end of the sentence. So from that point onward, many donor nations then raised family planning in developing countries to the level of humanitarian crisis and exponentially increased their spending in funding streams in this particular area. Now, according to the report by the UNFPA is the United Nations Population Fund, which actually is the UN agency that organized the Cairo conference, they stated in their 1993 report, which was the year before the ICPD Cairo conference, that the total amount of money which was spent by donors on family planning in the developing world on family planning and population assistance was $610 million. So I will apologize, I use a lot of numbers, you might notice, but I'm a scientist, so I deal a lot in numbers, and I apologize to you, but just speaking about this, $610 million went in that year, 1993, to provide family planning and population assistance. By 2012, which is only 19 years later, the same report stated that the total amount of funding allocated to the same cause of family planning and population program then it was increased to a staggering $12.4 billion. So 1993 it was $610 million. 2012 it was $12.4 billion with a B dollars. Now, if you're wondering what sort of increase this is, I have done the math, so you don't have to. You're welcome. The increase was an increase of 1,932%. If you can wrap your head around it, it's an increase of 1,932% from the year before the Cairo conference to this 2012 reference point in time. Now, one might attribute this astronomical increase of the overall aid as the overall increase in aid. So one could say perhaps just more aid is being given in 2012 than 1993. Another person could attribute it even to just a kind of a natural effect of inflation. But to put it into perspective, I have also tried to track the total amount of aid that was given in 93 and the total amount of aid that was given in 2012. The total amount of aid given in 93 was $56 billion. And then in 2012, it was $133 billion. Now, this represents an increase of 138%. Only 138%, which I know is kind of high, yes. It's over 19 years, but it's dwarfed by the huge increase in population control funding. Now, I'd like to, show you exactly how for Africa, how it has happened and how this amount of money has been skyrocketing since the Cairo conference. But before I do that, I just want you to get a little bit of a view of what the humanitarian aid funding, what it looks like. There are several sectors. When donors come in to give money to the developing world, they are giving it under, the social sector, economic production, multi-sectoral, the debt relief. So there are different things that they spend on. Now, comparing the allocation of funds by Africa's donors in the 1990s among the various aspects of the social sector foreign aid, which is where the population control and population programs fall under. Now, the least amount of money was given to population programs. So under the social sector foreign aid, you have education, which is quite important. You have water and sanitation. You have something they call government and civil services. Then you have healthcare, which is when one says aid to you, what most people would think about is the water, the education, the healthcare, all of that. But population is also one of that. In the early 1990s, population was the lowest indeed. So there was money for education and healthcare and water and sanitation, all these other things that the donors gave priority to. Growing up in Africa in the 1990s, I could attest to that. I never even heard anyone talking about big family planning projects that the donors were paying for. But we heard a lot about education. We heard a lot about scholarships being given. People were coming in to put water in communities and all of that. Population program was hardly ever talked about. It was the least. But this then steadily increased from the 1990s, and then since 2009, population program then became the highest of everything in the social sector foreign aid. It became the highest funding that is given by our Western donors. Now, I'm sure that many people of goodwill will agree with me that this is a very skewed and unbalanced approach to humanitarian aid. And this is why we will object. This is why we have been objecting to it. This is why we will continue to object to it. But whenever there is any objection to those who champion this cause over and above all other causes and all other issues in Africa, they quickly come back to us with the excuse that there are too many maternal deaths in Africa. So they run to maternal deaths. So let's take a closer look at the issue of maternal mortality in Africa and other parts of the world. Now, each year, there are about 300,000 women who die around the world in relation to childbirth and pregnancy. And of the 300,000, 1 in 2 of these maternal deaths actually occur in sub-Saharan Africa, so the region where we come from. About 42 countries make up the sub-Saharan African region. So that means this is very serious. If we are 1 in 2 cases, that means that we're exactly half of all the cases that happen in maternal mortality or maternal deaths. But what are the root causes of this problem? From well-established research and publications on this issue, the leading cause of maternal deaths in Africa is, without a doubt, severe bleeding, mostly bleeding after childbirth, the postpartum bleeding, which causes about 30% of the deaths. And I know this for sure for a number of reasons, because while I was working at the University Teaching Hospital in Nigeria, this was in the southeastern part of Nigeria, I was working in the blood bank. So I have my own professional experience from that, and also a number of people have died in my own life. About 5 women, in fact, have died in my own life, counting in the last 8 years or so. So cousins and close family friends and friends. So severe bleeding is by far the leading cause of maternal mortality in Africa. This is followed by postpartum infection, causing about 10% of the deaths. And then there's hypertensive disorders during pregnancy. So you talk of something like pre-eclampsia or eclampsia, causing about 9% of the maternal deaths. There's other things like obstructed labor. And then you go down that list, and about less than 4% of the maternal mortalities in sub-Saharan African region has so far been linked to abortion. So I have brought to you today, if you will excuse me, this document, which I will call the Exhibit 1 of my speech. Now, this document is a demonstration of how our major donors have decided to bestow primacy and therefore priority to issues based purely on ideology. Because sometimes when we say this, they tell us we are conspiracy theorists. So you say, oh no, these people, they're coming with their agenda, and they say, oh, you've come again with your agenda. Is there an agenda? Yes, there is an agenda, because we can prove it. And that's why I've brought this document today. Now, this is a document on maternal health. This is maternal health, which was written up and put together by the House of Commons, so the British Parliament, and it is by the International Development Committee. So that means, even though this is on maternal health, it has nothing to do with the UK, it's more about the international community, particularly the developing world, particularly the region of the world where I come from. Now, in this document, if you remember just now where I spoke of all the problems we have about maternal mortality, what is causing the most amount of deaths is severe bleeding, as I said, and then there's something like infection, and then there's hypertension, and there's all these other issues. Now, in this document, I have read it, as you can see, with all my little tapes on here. Bleeding or hemorrhage, they described right here in this document as the big killer. But together, these two words, bleeding and hemorrhage, are mentioned 3 times. And I've read it, page from cover to cover. Mentioned 3 times, speaking about maternal mortality in the developing world. Infection is mentioned 8 times. Hypertensive disorders or eclampsia, together, they're mentioned twice, so that 1 each. So I put it together as twice. Neonatal and baby, thinking of who's affected in maternal deaths, is the mother, but also a child is affected in every case, whether the child survives or not, but the child there is somebody else who is involved in maternal deaths. Neonatal, the word neonatal is mentioned 4 times. The word baby is mentioned 2 times. Now, talking about the solutions and how to end maternal mortality in the developing world, blood donation, blood transfusion, blood banking, all put together is mentioned 8 times. Contraception, contraceptives is mentioned 9 times. Marie Stopes International, which is the British abortion giant, is mentioned 9 times, all favorably. Family planning, in a document on maternal mortality, is mentioned 24 times. Abortion is mentioned 71 times. Now, this is something that is killing us in Africa. The big killer is the bleed, the hemorrhage. The big killer is the fact that African nations don't actually have good enough or sustainable enough blood banking systems, national blood services from country to country. And yet the British government or the British Parliament comes together And all these high-earning politicians say they're writing something about maternal deaths because they want to see the end of maternal mortality in the developing world. And they mention abortion 71 times, abortion that is only linked to less than 4% of the deaths. The reason I use this document is that it captures in a very clear and incontrovertible way that the brutal reality of ideologically driven prioritization. But I am not the only one that has noticed and raised alarm about this kind of thing, this kind of single-minded and unbalanced approach by Africa's Western donors, which is in fact a distraction and which takes away attention from the gaping inadequacies and have led directly to the lamentably high maternal deaths on our continent. A few months ago, the Independent Commission for Aid Impact, the ICAI, which is a little UK independent agency which scrutinizes aid spending, they made a similar observation in their 2018 report. This was only November of last year, so it's not that long ago. Now, this ICAI criticized the British government's Department for International Development for focusing its efforts too much on family planning measures, such as offering contraception and abortion rather than improving hospital care for women giving birth. And I assure you, the ICAI is not a pro-life organization by any stretch of imagination. They're actually very much pro all of those things. But they were still very critical because they had done a lot of survey and they did a lot of scrutinizing into the spending, and what they found, this is exactly what they said about it. They said, we find that the intensive focus on family planning, while valuable in its own right, has left the wider maternal health portfolio without a balanced approach across the different interventions that are needed to achieve significant reductions in maternal mortality over the medium to long term. Furthermore, we identified a number of shortcomings in the quality of maternal health. For example, progress on improving emergency obstetric and neonatal care has been well short on targets. Now, the part of this report, this 2018 ICAI report that actually strikes at the very core of the maternal health funding system is the part that stated that most maternal deaths in the developing world actually result from intentional pregnancies rather than accidental ones, and therefore not prevented by access to contraception. And I can attest to that myself, because the people I told you that I know who died, my cousin, my cousins, my close relations, my family friends, all of them died giving birth to children that they really, really wanted, and children that were very much embraced and welcomed. Now, we find that DFID did not, DFID, which is the Department for International Development, they did not pursue the strengthening of health systems to provide quality maternal care with the same intensity as it did for family planning, nor did it do enough to address the barriers that the poorest women face in accessing healthcare services. So when I read this, I said, thank you, ICAI. Somebody would think they consulted me or they hired me as a consultant. They didn't. They should have. But, but they still came up with this incredible statement anyway, which I found quite interesting coming from an organization like that. I would like to point out that even though this independent report scrutinized and criticized the Department for International Development and by extension the UK government's approach towards maternal health intervention in the developing world, I believe that this unbalanced approach is the one that most of our major donors are currently using. It's not just the UK government, even though the UK government were caught in the act by this agency, but other countries are doing the same thing. Now, foreign aid projects now reflect more the donors' ideas and ideologies rather than the recipient's needs. You know how I told you, when I was growing up, if anybody talked about a foreign agency coming to help or a foreign aid, coming into anywhere, it usually is quite easy to see that it's our needs. It's tailored according to our needs. So the scholarships, there's all these things that the Africans are clamoring for. And my dad would tell me then, study hard so you will get a British scholarship. I never got a British scholarship, but then it was something that a lot of people would ask children to aspire to. But these days, the foreign aid projects in African communities are reflecting more the donors' ideas and the donors' ideologies rather than the recipients' needs. Our powerful and prominent donors come to us with their own visions, their own definitions of the world. They have their own preconceived initiatives crafted in their own minds and in their own language. And when I say language, I actually don't mean English, French, German, Spanish. No, I'm actually speaking of amorphous terms wielded into shape by ideological wordsmiths. I'm talking of terms, words, and phrases that cannot be successfully translated into any African native tongue. I was at the UN one day, this was maybe 2 years ago or so, and somebody was talking about abortion and all of that. And I had to fight, even based on the point of language, that there's no way we can translate some of these terms into our own native tongue. Now take, for example, abortion. Abortion has existed for centuries. So we know in African countries what abortion is. We're not naive. We know what it is. In my own native language, the Igbo language, we have a way of saying what abortion is. But try as one might, abortion always has a negative connotation. No matter how it is said, no matter how you phrase it, abortion always has a negative connotation. This is because my people have always considered abortion to be a direct attack on human life at its most tender and vulnerable stage. We also see it as an attack on precious bloodlines that connect generations from past to present to future. It was only when I moved to the Western world that I realized that there are ways of sanitizing the term abortion by euphemizing it and saying something like the right to choose, reproductive rights, reproductive justice, termination of pregnancy, or someone who works in the hospital and the doctors are lazy, it's just TOP. Removal, yeah, they just write TOP, and I have to always ask myself, what are they saying? Okay, so the removal of product of conception, I mean, there are all these things to sanitize it, and the word just does not feature. The word abortion just does not feature. Now, in the mind of this African woman, these are terms that are completely meaningless if I try to translate it into my language. But these terms, however, are rendered meaningful and powerful in the regular parlance of our financial donors, but the worldview that has brought these terms into being is in fact very much removed from ours. Now, I attended a number of UN events. Actually, the CSW is one huge event, but they have various events every day. It's the so-called CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, and this was only 13 days ago, if I'm very specific. I was going to say 2 weeks ago, but I thought I should be specific. It was 13 days ago that I was sitting in one of those meetings, and I was completely incognito, because I was probably one of the few pro-life people, if that, who was sitting in that meeting. And the lady who was next to me kept asking me, so where are you from? So what work do you do? So what is your interest here? And I said to her, I'm a scientist. So she kept treating me really nice, and I thought, if only you know. But while I was sitting in on some of those meetings, it was horrifying for me to listen to some of the presentations, especially the presentations on abortion rights. These were all events that were hosted by nations, by Western nations, the wealthy Western nations, and these events had at their core the ambitious agenda to push for abortion rights as universal rights. Now, I brought my Exhibit 2 for you. This is the Exhibit 2 that I bring today. This document was handed to me in that meeting where I was sitting 13 days ago. And it's entitled the Brussels Declaration. Now, I'll tell you just a little anecdote about this little document. So, mind you, I got it in New York at the UN, and it didn't occur to me what the name was, but it's a manifesto. This is an abortion manifesto, so it has maybe 10 points or so of the things they're demanding. And mind you, they're hosting this event at the UN. So a week ago, exactly 1 week ago today, I was at the EU. And I was speaking in Brussels on a panel. And I brought this document because I wanted to rant about it. And the moment I lifted it and I said, the Brussels Declaration, then I remembered, oh, I'm sitting in Brussels. And seated just next to me was the former Prime Minister of Belgium. And I said to him, but don't evict me. Let me just say what I have to say, because I'm being critical of the Brussels Declaration right here in Brussels. But this is the Brussels Declaration, and I can only describe it as an abortion rights manifesto that has just as its target the universalizing of legal abortion. Now, just read out a few things that they are demanding, and this, mind you, it was a major UN event. They said that they reaffirm a woman's right to choose and to decide whether or not to pursue a pregnancy. They are calling for abortion to fall within the remit of healthcare in all countries of the world. They are calling for abortion to cease being considered as a crime or an offense, and for it to be removed from penal codes, from criminal code in these states or in all these countries where it remains the case. They are calling for abortion to be considered a health right and covered by social security in the countries. They also are rejecting any steps being taken towards granting a fetus legal personhood. So, now, I am not sure, while I was sitting there reading this document, if what had shocked me the most was the condescension for the cultural views and values of the hundreds of millions of people in the developing world, or whether it was the disdain for the millions of people who believe in the sanctity of human life at every stage and phase of development, or whether my shock was due to the complete disregard for the sovereign nations, especially nations in the developing world, that have so much pride in their judicial system, in their penal codes that they've set up, in all the way their own systems work. And mind you, these are nations who have only gained independence from colonization in the last couple of years. And here comes the Brussels Declaration hitting directly at those nations. Now, receiving this document at the United Nations headquarters was like a slap on my African face. And I have no doubt that it will feel the same way to an overwhelming majority of the people where I come from. So I have a brother whose middle name is Ndubuisi. It's an Igbo name, Ndubuisi, which in Igbo means life is paramount, or life is most important, or life is first. And I never gave much thought to the full meaning of this name. Maybe because I used to fight with him so much growing up. So I wouldn't be thinking, how nice is your name? So, but anyway, I never really gave much thought to the implications of this name until recently, when I was reflecting on the views of my people regarding the sanctity of human life. I realized that one can tell a lot about a people's belief system from the names they bestow upon their children. Naming a child is an opportunity for parents, and in some cases grandparents, to tell the world around them what is most important to them. So my brother went through life, or he's going through life, with a name that is really a very pro-life name. His life is paramount. At the core of my people's value system is the profound recognition that human life is precious, it's paramount, and yes, it's supreme. For us, abortion, which is the deliberate killing of the little ones in the womb, and don't attack me, anybody, I'm just repeating my grandmother's views here, is a direct attack on the innocent human life. It's a serious injustice which no one should have the right to commit. Perhaps Africans tend to oppose abortion more because safely bringing a healthy baby into the world is much more difficult. As I had mentioned in the maternal mortality cases, it's much more difficult in our part of the world than the developed countries. Perhaps the Africans are more grateful for every pregnancy and every successful delivery, and for that matter, for every dawn they rise to see, because the Africans have a deeper awareness of the preciousness and the precariousness of human life. This view of abortion is shared by people in many other parts of Africa beyond my own tribe and my own city and my own country. As I mentioned earlier, I have traveled throughout the continent, and I've spoken to so many people. An overwhelming majority of the people I have met, people of all ages, backgrounds, professions, socioeconomic classes, and religious affiliations, have expressed the same firm respect for the preciousness and precious value of every human life from conception to natural death. Lest my experience be dismissed as purely anecdotal, surveys corroborate my findings. A 2013 global study by Pew Research Center that surveyed more than 40,000 respondents in 40 countries, that means developed countries as well as the developing countries, that they were asking people their moral views on different issues, including abortion. Now, the overwhelming majority of the African residents who were surveyed said that abortion was morally unacceptable to them in every case. 92% of the people surveyed in Ghana said this. 88% of those surveyed in Uganda said the same thing. 82% of the people surveyed in Kenya, 80% of the people surveyed in my own country, Nigeria, said that they would consider abortion as completely unacceptable to them. Now, from this survey, one can also easily see the proportions of Africans that are opposed to abortion, that it contrasts starkly with the people in the developed world or in the first world who have the same views, because this survey was so good that it surveyed people in so many countries. So you could see how people in Germany feel and how people in France feel and how people in England and America feel. So you can see also just the stark difference where the Africans stand and where a lot of these Western countries stand. This is why I believe that our views on this issue, as well as many other issues, are in fact irreconcilable. And yet we find ourselves at a difficult and sometimes impossible position where the donors get to determine the framework of our policies, the direction of the funding, the solution of our problems. Unfortunately, in most cases, the donors are reluctant to consider African cultural views and values when they deal with us. They see the developing world as a cultural vacuum to be filled with their ideas, or fallow land to be cultivated with their ideologies. And what is more disconcerting is that they approach us from a place of perceived superiority, and thus with high expectations of compliance by African governments. I'll just say a little thing about superiority just here. So I know a lot of people talk about the supremacy and white supremacy and all these kinds of things, but in the work that I have done, I will tell you the one thing that I can tell you for sure is happening, especially with regards to Africa and other developed countries in the West. There is a kind of superiority going on. No, it's not white supremacy. It's ideological supremacy. They come to us and they say, we know what is better for you. We understand what needs to be done. They are giving us the solutions. Yes, there is some kind of supremacy, but it's an ideological and cultural supremacy and imperialism that is going on. And what is most, what is most annoying is that they have such high expectations of compliance by African governments. And I, as an African, am ashamed to say that in most cases, our governments bow and kowtow to this kind of cultural supremacy. This is the uncomfortable dynamic of the modern day ideological colonialism, which has developed between the Western donors and the recipients in the developing world. I know that I am speaking today to mostly men and women of goodwill who mean well, and who want to see an end to all forms of injustice and make no mistakes about it: ideological neocolonialism, cultural supremacy, cultural imperialism, ideological supremacy. All of these are forms of injustice which strip people of their dignity while masquerading as a helping hand. This is why my appeal to you today is for more people to speak up against this insidious problem in all its manifestations. I am pleading for foreign aid to be done differently, with the voices of recipients at the center of consideration, with aid projects reflecting more the people's real needs than the donors' ideological positions. My hope is that ideologically wielded oxymoronic terms like safe abortion be left outside the shores of developing nations, where women are in fact just asking for safe deliveries of their babies. But then they offer us safe abortions, as you can see in this fine manual by the British Parliament. People deserve respect, even if they are on the receiving side of the equation. They do deserve their dignity, and that's why I love the theme of this particular event, the Human Dignity Lecture. Human dignity doesn't have to do with how much money one has, or how poor, or how wealthy one is. Everybody should have their dignity. And that's the one thing living my entire childhood and part of my adulthood in Africa, I know a lot of people who are poor, whether people who are uneducated, people who who you would look at and say, my goodness, how unfortunate you are. But I will tell you the one thing, that even having lived in Europe as well and seen wealth and seen where things work in a sense of speaking, the one thing that I know the Africans hang on to, no matter how rich or poor, is their dignity. And that's so important. Yes, they may be poor and they need to come out of poverty, but then they are holding on to their dignity, and that makes their life worth living. I, as an African woman, I am looking forward to the day when the culture of undefined and indefinite foreign aid will be eradicated. I am looking forward to the rise of African nations to full stature, when our nations will embark on the right path to the eradication of poverty. I am hoping to see the day of economic liberation for African nations, and I am looking forward to seeing the dawn of ideological decolonization of my people, and that day will be indeed our day of complete and true independence. That will be the day our dignity is assured and affirmed, and on that day I will be very proud to say that I am an African who will stand in dignity, in equality with everybody or anybody from any other part of the world. Thank you.
Friends, we do have time for a few questions.
Yes. I was fortunate enough to spend 2 weeks a week or so, and fortunate enough to spend it on a shamba in West End, where people don't usually get to go. And part of what I saw there was the effects of colonization, in a sense that you're never going to get aid without strings attached. Mm-hmm. And the point here is, that I'm trying to make here, is that the people of East Africa awoke to that realization not too long ago. In 2015, they took steps to ensure the road to economic development. Yes. There's only one road out of poverty, historically, and that is the production of cloth.
Yeah.
If you look at it, Europe in the 14th century, England in the 18th century, America in the 19th century, all of these places became industrial powers by beginning with the production of cloth. The one thing that the East Africans cannot do right now is produce cloth because of one thing, and it's called mutumba, which is the Swahili word for used clothing. The main ideological barrier to development in East Africa right now is free trade. So the Africans banned mutumba. In East Africa, they banned mutumba in 2015, and the United States State Department immediately put them under sanctions, and all the East African countries backed down except for Rwanda. Paul Kagame did not back down, okay? So the point here is that this is a way to develop, that the people themselves can develop, but they have to come to the conclusion that what comes from the outside is impoverishing them.
Right.
Specifically, this free trade ideology that demands the acceptance of mutumba in East Africa, even though the politicians know that it's crippling.
Right, thanks, Mike. That is true. There is much work to be done on trade. This should be the kind of thing that we hear at the UN more. This is because at the UN, I would always be more confident if things like this come up at the UN, because the nations stand shoulder to shoulder, if you like, right? It's not so obvious at that point who is the donor and who is the recipient. So people can stand shoulder to shoulder and challenge one another, but then it doesn't come up. I mean, we just had 2 weeks of the women's event, the CSW, things like this, because the trade affects women. Women are the ones who are trading. Women are the ones who go to the market. They call it matumba in Kenya. We call it okrika in Nigeria. It's very common, people getting clothes that say, I love New York, and you're standing in the middle of a Nigerian village, and because we got these used clothes from different Western countries. We should be discussing these things because Africans need to be, we need to get our economic liberation, and that's why I end with that idea. As an African person, I just want to see the economic liberation of my people, so we don't even need aid at all. That would be the ideal.
I was wondering, so many women die in childbirth from bleeding, and I was wondering if that's due to lack of facilities, lack of people who are willing to donate blood. Is that because of superstition or fear? And also then the infrastructure. Sure.
So this is a fantastic one, especially for me, because as I said, I had worked in a blood bank in Nigeria, and it's like how weird it is that one has worked in a blood bank in Nigeria, right? So we used to do whole blood donation system. We don't have a good national blood service in the first place. So when someone is about to give birth, for example, the hospital will tell a woman, go and get all your brothers and sisters. And then we line them up and we do the test, and we start to talk to them, whoever is a match. Then we start to talk to them about donating blood, so we need about 3 units of blood to cover a delivery. So we have to tell them at that point, when we realize they're the same blood group and they're a match, explain to them why they need to give blood to their sister or for their sister. And at that point too, you see some interesting things in how the human behavior is, because sometimes someone will say, no, I don't want to give blood. At that point they cry and they're not happy they're a match, right? So these are family members, and the person who is pregnant is crying, you've betrayed me. And then also when we tell them we have to test for like HIV before the blood is then taken, then they don't want to be tested for some of these other things that we're testing for. So the system is horrible, and you can then see how difficult it is, even just to get 3 units of blood, for example. People do accept blood donations, and we don't. There is some superstition, but it's not. It's something that a medical professional can walk through. You can counsel somebody and get them to the point where they are accepting blood or they are donating blood. But that's not enough, and that's not how it should work. There should be a national blood service. There should be the processors, and in Nigeria we do what we call the whole blood transfusion. That means we get blood from a person, we transfuse it into another person. Then I went to the UK and found found out, actually, no, you have to fractionate blood. So you have to separate it and get like what we call a packed blood unit, so which is more concentrated units. But for that, you need huge facilities, you need all kinds of things. It costs a lot of money to run a national blood service that is sustainable and that can hold a system together. So ours, we're not even at a surface. We haven't even begun to build up that system in most of the African countries, and that's why women will continue to die until the international community realizes it, or the nations, better still, the nations themselves will realize it and do more to build up their blood service systems.
With all the money coming in, do you see people getting tricked into using contraceptives, getting tricked into abortions? A few years ago, I heard even in vaccines there was some kind of birth control agent or abortifacient being used. Can you talk about that?
Great. Okay, that was in Kenya. So there's so much money going to contraception and family planning and abortion, that what then happens, particularly the IUDs and all those kind of contraceptives, when they come in, the donors want to also see that it's being used, so they are counting and asking for numbers back, because at the end of the day, they want to say, oh, there is now an increase by 10% of contraception usage in the country, and they quote these things for us. So they give the money through organizations, NGOs like International Planned Parenthood Federation or Marie Stopes International that I mentioned a bit earlier, which is an abortion NGO, British NGO. So they give it through those, and those people then employ the locals. So when you get to like a Kenyan village or Nigerian village, they hire locals to do the work. And if you hire a local nurse, for example, and then tell her that she gets a bonus for more women giving contraceptives in her village, she would then go call all her sisters. She will convince everybody in her local, in her sphere. And that's how we see, because of the incentivizing of some of these programs, that women and nurses, local nurses, then go all out to get more women to take up contraceptives and to, go to these organizations, because they're getting more for the numbers that they're chunking out. So for them, we are just a statistic. And then they put the pressure on the local professionals, and the local professionals have influence over people around their lives, and like that they're getting millions of people on these things. But what they don't realize is that you come into a village and you give IUDs, which is intrauterine device, to women. We have seen it happen. Within a couple of months, those women notice side effects, they notice changes in their lives, they notice weight gain, hair loss, any of those things, they will remove it. So even surveys have shown that Africa has had, in the last couple of years, the highest discontinuation rate. But nobody talks about the discontinuation rate, which I think for Western taxpayers, they should be asking the agencies, how about what you're doing with our money? Because it's like you spend all this money, billions of dollars, you give IUDs to people, within a couple of months they've removed it anyway, or they've gotten rid of it, or if they're implants, they still get rid of it. That's it, and women just don't want to use these things, and most times you put them on it, half of them get off of it within a couple of months or within a year, and the next batch of contraception people come through, and they start to sell it. It's like a marketing skill or a marketing strategy, and they continue to use it because somebody is getting wealthy off of it. There are people in pharmaceutical companies in Western countries who are making tons of money and making six-figure salaries because of the numbers they are getting in Kenya and Uganda and Nigeria and whatever country. The other day somebody was saying, oh yeah, there's such a high usage of contraception now in Zimbabwe, and they're praising themselves. But these were not Zimbabweans. These are some Americans whom I'm sure will get some bonus at the end of the day. So it's also part of all of these things that you see the injustice right there, that they go to these poorer parts of the world and they're treating us as mere statistic. They're treating us as just a way or a means to get into higher levels and to doing things, and not even talk of things like research and what they're doing and taking data off of African women. And of course, there are those cases that come up, like the Kenyan case, where people started saying that somebody was given tetanus, some kind of tetanus vaccine, 6 courses of it, so 6 doses of it, to girls who are childbearing age. And some local doctors were saying that what they were giving were actually sterilizing these girls. So the whole struggle came up, and I've read a paper on it that showed why it was true and how the investigations were done to show that indeed maybe even the World Health Organization was involved in sterilizing young Kenyan girls, but the World Health Organization also published their own paper to show that they didn't. So, but you know, they're doing some of these things, and because there's no oversight in some of these ways, these are deep in villages where nobody will ask, there is no regulatory body, there's nobody who is going to come ask them for accountability. I think they're doing all kinds of things that would run into even, you know, human rights abuse. But we're still on it. I would like to see somebody sue somebody, you know. So I keep saying, one day I'm going to try and get some legal person to come in, and we get some African women who have been hurt by some of these contraceptives. Well, let's go sue Pfizer, and let's get some African women out of poverty by the time we get them $19 million in compensation. I'd like to see that happen. Honestly, I'm still working on it, but we would like to really sue them, because in African countries, I've never heard even of one person who has had any kind of settlement whatsoever for damages caused by contraception. And we know every day that it's causing people some real damage, but they don't have the means to sue big companies like that. And every contraception, by the way, in Africa is provided from the West, because we don't manufacture them. They're all imported. So I think we should be suing them. We should be suing them to the point where they run away, because there'll be so many people who are in line to come out of poverty that maybe Pfizer would then leave us alone.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Maternal. I'm from Uganda. Thanks so much. I saw you visited our parliament recently.
Oh, great.
And this was a wonderful presentation. These issues matter to me. I'm a dad of a young girl who was born at 24 weeks and 5 days, weighing just 1 pound. Wow. Well, for Africans, 400 grams. We get her reduced to about 380. She's now 2 years, and so I'm passionate about these things. Wonderful. But I guess the question that I haven't really understood is the why question. Is the overpopulation of Africa kind of a threat to the Western world, such that they aggressively pursue this agenda?
Wonderful. So why are they doing this? I get this question all the time, but I think that this is a confluence issue. This is one issue that is important to several factions of people in the West, that they come together as the end is the results. They want the one end result, but they all have different intentions or different things pushing them. There are, of course, the people who do have that concern, the population bomb. They are at that point where perhaps when the book, Paul Ehrlich's book, was written about the population bomb, they're still in that mindset that, oh, Africa is coming to the point where there'll be how many billions, and they will be. It was. Bill Gates, who was saying Africa is going to make up like 50% of the population in the world. Yeah, why not? Why can't we? So what? There are the people who have the concern that population is coming up, and some of them say, oh, well, we don't want to see people struggling for food, for water. And the Africans themselves, a lot of our African leaders are swayed by this argument, because they're all afraid, and somebody comes from the West and tells them, already you have poverty. Imagine if there's double population. Then you see our leaders struggling to implement some of these family planning measures. Even in Nigeria, I heard someone talking about a 2 or 3 child policy and all that, because they're genuinely afraid, because that's what some people are selling it with in Africa. But then there are the people who have the environmental concerns. They just don't want more than 7 billion people in the world. So there are the environmentalists, the people who are saying they don't want more people in the world. There are the people who I will call the GOD complex. So they feel they know, they feel that they are the saviors and they should be the saviors of Africa, and they come in with their own thing, with their own ideas and their own solution plans. And that's where I'd say I classify the Gates, because with all due respect to them, they come in and they don't listen. It's like they don't listen to the people, but they already have all their plans mapped out from here, and they're just coming in to execute. Then there are, of course, I'd say the most problematic people will be the militant feminists, who come in with the idea that unless women have this and unless women have that in terms of sexual and reproductive health and rights, then they're not equal to men, no matter what you argue with them, no matter what you tell them, that the way to get women to real equality, the way to get women the right status in society and the full dignity in society is to get them to that point where they're all educated, they're all in professional work, or they're all able to pursue professional work if they want to. Then these women would make decisions for themselves that are very well informed. They can read inserts, for example, before taking in contraceptives. They know what abortion is, they know what it entails. So I believe that the empowered African woman is the educated African woman. But the feminist comes in and all they just want is to see these rights, and they're coming with things like the Brussels Declaration, and they're doing their thing. So it's a confluence issue. And those who come with the mercy complex as well, who just like, oh, look at these Africans. Oh, imagine 10 children. Oh, 5 children. And they're so hungry. Maybe they shouldn't have more. Maybe they should have their abortion and then we can have less children. So there's so many people with so many interests, but they all have the one goal and they're working together and they're coming off mostly from the same countries in the West. And that's our problem.
Yes.
Is anyone doing foreign aid the right way? I mean, who's doing what you want? Who could be supported by the people here?
Obviously, there are people who are doing amazingly well. I am not saying people shouldn't come to help. There are people who are running programs, but usually they're smaller programs. There are people who come on what they call medical missions, and I applaud those people who come in and they do they set up eye clinics and they're giving people these surgeries that they couldn't have had otherwise, and they set up all kinds of things. So yes, there are people who are doing real humanitarian work. It might sound biased, but the Catholic Church has done amazing things through their own agencies or through their own networks, and I've seen the church do incredible things among the poorest of the poor. So yes, there is a place to help your fellow man or woman, who is in need, and yes, there are people who are doing it. The problem is their budgets are so small. So even if it's an organization like a Catholic, aid agency or whatever, and their entire budget might just be like 5 million, which seems like a huge amount, but imagine that they're standing next to Germany that is giving 500 million, right? So it's nothing. It's almost like a drop compared to the bigger agencies. There are people, usually faith-based, and some are not non-faith-based, but the faith-based ones are the ones that at least you're sure that when they're coming, they draw a line and they say, we won't pass this point. We would only stick to this surgery and that surgery and that surgery, and we will not go into these other things. So sometimes you can see from websites and you can see who a person, if you want to support an organization, just check who they support and who they're dealing with and who they're partnering with. Some organizations that I thought they were okay, like the Médecins Sans Frontières, who are always at points where there's the worst crisis. The other day just made a statement on how they think African countries should have abortion. And that in and of itself is unfortunate, because that means that in all their work in Africa, they absolutely have not listened to the African people, the majority of the African people. So there are people who are doing it, but it's just to find out who's who. The nations themselves, who are the biggest donors, most are not doing aid right. The United States took a fantastic step early last year, beginning of 2017, and they reinstated the Mexico City policy, which is phenomenal. That means that the American government, through the executive arm, so the president, and any funding coming through that part of your government, will not fund abortions overseas. So they defunded International Planned Parenthood Federation, Marie Stopes International. So that's an incredible step. The EU is still funding these organizations, though the UK is still funding these organizations. So there are some good things that happen, but there is much to be done. There's much more to be done.
Friends, maybe we have time for one more question.
Yeah, that's, yes, wonderful.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk about maybe some of the more beneficial policies that you've seen.
Sorry?
I was wondering if you could talk about maybe some of the more beneficial policies you've seen in family planning and what we should be supporting according to you, like condom distribution and the HIV/AIDS epidemic, things that you agree with.
Okay, wonderful. So,
Now, you're going to be so disappointed because I'll tell you about condoms and HIV, what happened, because it seems like a common sense solution, but I have read a lot from a man who used to be at Harvard. He was a Harvard professor and he was an expert in HIV prevention, not a Catholic at all, not even a conservative in any sense of speaking, not traditional in any sense of speaking. This guy went out, did about 25 years worth of work in a lot of the African countries where AIDS was hitting the hardest in the 90s and early 2000s. His name is Edward Green, so you can take down his name. Or you can read my book, better still. But he has published some fine peer-reviewed journal articles about this, that the HIV problem happened, and many of our donors came together and came up with this common sense solution, which was condom distribution. At the moment, as of today, about 1 billion condoms come into Africa every year. 1 billion. It's been like that since the 90s. Or maybe since the 90s. I mean, they keep increasing condom supplies, but hey, the HIV infection, the new infection rate still has remained the same for years. So at the end of each year, we still have a couple of hundreds of thousands who are new infections in African countries, even though nobody is talking about them anymore. And yet, our condom supplies are there, and the condom supplies are either going up, never going down, but it keeps going up. Now, the one country that resisted that approach, the condom approach, the general blanket condom approach, was Uganda. Is there a Ugandan here? So Uganda Uganda went all out. President Museveni had resisted it. He and his wife said, well, we're not convinced. They came together, they put together a committee on AIDS prevention, and they came up with the ABC approach, which of course has at the beginning of it, abstinence for people who are not married, being faithful for people who are married, so you be faithful and be monogamous, and then the C being condoms if it's impossible for you to do either A or B. Now, even speaking to the people who were part of that committee, you would find out that there is only a tiny subset of society that they meant to see for, and that's like, who they will call the commercial sex workers and things like that. So where it's impossible, but the Ugandans felt we are going down. If we let this disease ravage our country, at one point in time, I think around 1989, about 30% of the adult population in a certain age bracket were affected by HIV, and they felt we're going to be wiped out by this disease. So went on this drastic approach, the zero grazing approach. They did it with everything they had. They were setting up posters, going into schools. The president and his wife were going into schools and speaking to children. So this, within a short space of time, I would say, it was something like within 6 years, they had such a decrease in the rate of HIV infection that up to today, 2019, nobody has seen anything even close to that in any other country. It was a drastic drop from something like 30% to like 5%. It was huge, massive drop. And that was because there was such a behavioral change that, but for you to drive behavioral change, it's not just telling people no sex, no, it's a complete lifestyle. It's something that they should be systematic, they should be strategic, they should be sophisticated in the way they introduce these things to society. It's the way, like, you're trying to end, lung cancer and all the things that have to do with it, is the systematic way that Western countries are now fighting smoking in many ways and supporting people through it, and they're giving classes and they're doing all kinds of things to support people who want to live this lifestyle so that you can live this other healthier lifestyle. That was what the Ugandans did, and they had achieved such success that is written down by people like Edward Green. And Edward Green himself, being a man who was not in any way conservative or traditional, was convinced by what he saw on ground working in Uganda and also working in other African countries, because he said wherever they put the condoms in other African countries, the HIV you can track the path, because you come back after a year, wherever you've dumped a lot of condoms, there is going to be some kind of increase in infection rate. It's not me saying, this is a scientific point of view that was recorded and that was trackable, and those who were to tracked it and did mention this is exactly what was going on. And the explanation they gave was that wherever you dump some of these things like condoms, then the behavior changes. The behavior changes because people, for you to even bring in condoms, sometimes the UN agencies bring in condoms, they're bringing it with a very eroticized program, so they're doing a big rave on condom, they bring in girls, they bring, there's all these kind of things. When you see the pictures, you'd be like, what's going on here? So there is so much behavioral change that also comes along the path of these things, and people are more careless, they're taking higher risks, and then you give them condom, they don't use it, they don't get to what the manufacturers call the perfect use. So there's all these things that even as a scientist, even from a scientific point of view, I don't agree with it. I agree with the Ugandan approach. If it worked in Uganda, it can work in other places, but for us to do it, we have to have the right support. We cannot have countries undermining our programs as they've been undermining, a nation like Uganda. They had a lot of pushback from the international community. So I think something like natural family planning can be used, female fertility awareness can be used. I know it sounds cliche, but I think is what is actually compatible with most the tempo and the life that people live in these parts of the world. You can't go to a place and bring in a medicine or some kind of vaccine that needs refrigeration in a place where there is no electricity. I don't know if it makes sense, right? But you think you're doing some good, you bring some milk, but then that milk needs refrigeration. Oh, but this village doesn't have electricity. So I think that in many ways, something like female fertility awareness, some of these things can be properly introduced, and these are lifestyles, and this is something that women can choose if they so want. But again, just in full disclosure, there is no African country where contraception is illegal anyway. Women can use contraception anywhere they want. It's subsidized, it's cheap, but we've seen too many cases, and whenever there are problems, there is nobody that can be held accountable, as those people are they're too big and they're too far away.